Welcome to the Diversity in STEM podcast, where we interview leaders in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to help inspire students of all ages. My name is Joe Kent, and I'm the Director of Education for the National Atomic Testing Museum. My guest today is Dr. David Chavez. Dr. David Chavez is the Deputy Group Leader of the High Explosive Science and Technology Group at Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's a highly respected scientist known for his many innovations in the area of energetic materials, particularly in developing novel low-smoke, high-nitrogen pyrotechnics and the synthesis of a potential replacement for TNT. He joined Los Alamos National Laboratory in 2003 for a postdoctoral appointment as a Frederick Reines Distinguished Fellow, becoming a full staff member in 2006. He holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech, and a Ph.D. in organic chemistry from Harvard University. Dr. Chavez's many honors, appointments, and awards include the Department of Energy's Lawrence Award, Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and member of the Board of Trustees for Caltech, where he serves on multiple committees. Hello, Dr. Chavez. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you a little bit about my journey through my career in STEM.
Well, we were excited when you agreed to be on the podcast because the work you do is fascinating, and so we'll just dive into the questions. I can't wait to talk about it.
Sounds great.
Now, to give our listeners a chance to get to know you better, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I grew up in a small town in northern New Mexico. It's called Taos. It has maybe about 4,000 people population-wise. I grew up in a low middle income family, so we didn't really have a lot of resources either within the family and within the community. We didn't have a lot of resources with respect to understanding or exploring STEM careers. So I really didn't know any scientists. I maybe knew of a person who was a civil engineer. The only exposure that I had to really science and mathematics was through school. So, but I did have a person in my life that really supported my sort of interests in a broad range of things, and that was my mom. So she got me a number of different encyclopedias, youth encyclopedias and things. And I would flip through them. And one of the things that fascinated me quite a bit was astronomy. So I started learning the names of the planets and things like that. So I was a kid that was pretty interested in STEM, relatively good at it, but I also had other interests too. I played in sports, both like Little League or with the school system and things like that. So in general, I would say that I was probably like the typical kid, had some interest in school, had some interest in sports, and was able to have an environment that allowed me to at least explore some of these different things.
Well, that's fantastic. And you talked about your interest in STEM, and you mentioned astronomy. So, but of course, we were talking about in your biography, you ended up getting into chemistry. So, what got you interested in chemistry specifically? And was there a particular moment when you decided that was what you wanted to study and build a career around? As
I was exploring different areas of interest in high school, I was still pretty strongly interested in astronomy, physics, astrophysics. The one thing that my high school had, though, that I think helped me out when I went into college was they offered a second year of chemistry. We didn't have any AP classes at my high school at the time. So the second year of chemistry allowed me to explore just the very early beginnings of organic chemistry. And I think it gave me this foundation, I guess, that I think was a little bit out of the norm for most students from small communities, but even kids in more urban areas, I think it maybe like provided an on par type of an experience. And so I felt very prepared with chemistry. So when I went to school at my undergraduate institution, I still had this interest in astronomy and astrophysics, and I had this interest in or at least foundation, very strong foundation I felt in chemistry. And as I thought about a career, you know, what am I going to do after I get out of college? You know, when I entered my freshman year, I really was not completely aware of what STEM careers were available to me. But I also had a very strong tie and sort of a commitment to wanting to go back to New Mexico. And luckily I had participated in a summer program at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I knew there were science jobs in New Mexico. But I didn't feel like I could be guaranteed a job as a scientist, but I knew that if I went into the medical field, that I could be a doctor anywhere, and I didn't really have to sort of bet on applying for a science job. So what I decided to do in college was to stick with a chemistry major, but be pre-med. And my initial goal was to come back to New Mexico and go to a medical school here at Albuquerque and at the University of New Mexico, and then enter into you know, a medical field. So that was what I chose as my path, and that's how I focused on chemistry.
So that's interesting. I wasn't expecting that. So you were looking at pre-med and potentially getting into the medical field, which is unexpected. So we'll have to talk a bit more later on the questions about where that kind of deviated, because that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Now you spoke about your mom earlier. So she obviously was very much encouraging you to you know, just broaden your knowledge.
Right.
Now, were there any other family members or teachers or even experts in the field who encouraged and motivated you when you wanted to get into chemistry and the pre-med field?
So my mom was a huge factor for sure, but one of the things that she did was she would highlight relatives that she wanted me to sort of emulate, and she wouldn't say that explicitly, but you know, thinking back now, you know, I realized that what she was trying to do was show me role models, and role models in ways that she couldn't be a role model, even though she was a huge impact and influence in my life. And sort of just briefly off the topic, my mom was born with a arm deformity. So she only had her left arm up to just past her elbow. But I never saw my mom as a handicapped person, because she could do anything that a regular person could do. She drove a stick shift, she swam, she rode a bike, she tied her shoelaces, you know, figured out how to tie her shoelaces with one hand. So I never really saw her as that, as having sort of any kind of impediment to being able to do things. And I think in many ways, I think that kind of really formed the basis for me as to, you know, giving this effort to try to do as much as I could, because I saw my mom be able to do things even though she didn't have the same advantages as you know, all the rest of us have. But she pointed out one of my cousins as a person that was a role model, and so whatever he did, I wanted to do. So I paid a lot of attention to watching him. If he was interested in math and science, then you know, that's what I was doing as a kid. Any kind of clubs or sports or things that he did, I followed in that pathway. And it really was because of that role model that I had unknowingly was preparing myself to be competitive with respect to applying for college. And then, you know, others, I would say my science and math teachers in school. My math teacher in 8th grade, he was my geometry teacher, but he was also my basketball coach. And he was, you know, that year I probably learned the most math that I had ever learned up to that point, just because of the way he taught. And then, being with him in basketball, he was a very interesting coach. And, I remember one time we were running sprints and, we were all tired, and he said, are you guys tired yet? And we're like, yeah, we're exhausted. And he said, well, looks like we're not in shape. Got to run more sprints. And so then we ran more sprints, right? And then he asked us the same question again. And it's like, well, we know the right answer now. The right answer is we're not tired. So he asked us the question and he said, are you guys tired yet? No, we're not tired. And then he said, well, let's get tired. And so he made us run more sprints. So there was like no right answer. It was just, he was going to make us run sprints, but it was definitely a funny memory that I have of him in outside of the context of learning mathematics from him.
But you brought up a great point. Sometimes we don't really talk about it, but that competitive nature, preparing for the competition, whether it's getting into a good school or out in the professional fields that we go into, competition is a part of it. And
Right.
So it's interesting that even at a younger age, whether it's through your cousin being a role model and your one teacher, they're teaching you to be motivated, hungry, and competitive, and which I'm sure has served you well,
Yeah,
because that's something we don't necessarily think about.
yeah, those role models really sort of got me on a path to wanting to improve myself. And actually, that's a perfect sort of segue into one story that really kind of defines the way I approach things. I had a different cousin that I, watched and interacted with, and he was a year ahead of me in school, and I really loved basketball. And so the only time you could start actually playing competitively was in 7th grade. And he made the team, in 7th grade. So I asked him, what do you need to do to make the team? And he said, you need to be able to do a left-handed and a right-handed layup. That's like one of the cutoff things. And I didn't know how to do a left-handed layup. So all summer long, that's all I did was practice left-handed layups. I didn't even practice right-handed. I just practiced left-handed layups. And by the time tryouts came around, and I went through the process, I was selected to be on the team, and the coach actually thought I was left-handed because I had practiced so much with my left hand. And it's that kind of an attitude that I've had towards things, sort of goal setting, putting that goal out there, not being able to like have necessarily all the tools at the beginning, but figuring out how to do those things, and then asking people for help, asking them, how do you do this? Or how did you get there? Or what things helped you to progress, to achieve the goal that you set out? And so, I sort of had that as my, I guess, very initial example of, if you put the effort in, even if you don't know how to do it at the beginning, you can get there and you can find success. So I think those really early experiences helped to develop a mindset that I had that helped me persevere through challenging times.
And, wow, that is such a great lesson too, is this, being able to persevere, but also to know when to ask questions and the right questions to ask, and to kind of see like what do you need to prep for?
Right.
So that next level, what do I need to get to the goals that I have? What do I need to focus on? But also at the same time, though, once you have that information, and then that's when the real work starts, right? To get where you want to go. So that's great, and that's a lot of things that we've heard, with past guests is, knowing that it's okay to ask for help, and oftentimes that drives us, and that gets us where we need to go, because we're not afraid to build those relationships, and then at the end of the day, put that work in.
Right.
So it's great to hear. That's a great lesson for sure. Now let's fast forward a bit to 2003. So since starting at Los Alamos National Laboratory that year, you've risen to become the deputy group leader of the High Explosive Science and Technology Group, which, if I'm being honest, sounds really cool. But what originally drew you to that department? And then to build off of an earlier question is, how did you go from originally being pre-med and wanting to get to the medical field to then getting into going to Los Alamos National Laboratory like you originally had explored?
So the most critical part of all of this sort of pathway and story is that after my sophomore year in high school, I had the opportunity to apply for and participate in a summer research program at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. And it was sponsored through the American Chemical Society. It was called Project Seed. And that was my first actual experience with real scientists in a real laboratory environment. I got to tour all kinds of different facilities. I got to interact with different scientists, presented a poster where scientists came by and asked questions. And I had a mentor that I worked with. His name was Bill Earl. And it was that experience that, started me on the path to thinking I could really go to school for a degree in the sciences. And then the program itself, they had a second summer, and I participated. That was the first year that they offered a second summer research opportunity. It was called Project Seed 2, and I participated in that. And I had a different mentor. His name was Dave Chavez, and in that experience, I was able to work with another high school student as well. So it was a little bit of a different experience because you were working side by side with another student. There was somebody that was sort of your age. You could kind of talk to each other about the same kind of things that you both were experiencing. But I also had a mentor that was a postdoctoral student for Dave Chavez. And it was in a completely different area. The first area I was studying the permeability of salt gels, and then the second one I was studying the high pressure effects and state of carbon dioxide. And so it was just this experience that I would never have had the opportunity to explore were it not for this summer program, Project Seed. So what did it do? It allowed me to start forming a network at the lab. So I knew two scientists here at the laboratory, and I had a I had a science project in high school, and I said, hey, I'm working on this math science project. Do you know anybody who could help me with it? And so they hooked me up with a mathematician here at the lab, and so my network broadened more and more. And so when I went to college, after my freshman year, I thought, I want to go back home for the summer, and I want to see if I can work at the lab again. And so I called up Dave Chavez and I said, hey, do you have any spots for me? And he said, I don't have any spots available, but I'll ask around and see if any other organizations do. And the one organization that reached out is the organization that I'm in now. And so,
wow.
My first summer here in this group was in 1993, and I worked with Ray Flesner and John Kramer, and they were chemical engineers, and they were interested in taking explosives that were kind of not in use or not in need anymore, and getting rid of them by in an environmentally friendly way, and turning them into something that was essentially non-hazardous. And this was for a much larger project that was of interest to the Department of Defense and their bigger operations. And so it was a multiple sort of network kind of process that led me into what I currently do today, because that first summer I ended up seeing another scientist here who was a chemist, and his name was Mike Hiskey. And I saw the student that worked for him and how they interacted and just how excited he was about the chemistry that he did. And so the next winter, for winter break, I said, can I work with you during winter break and just do chemistry with you? And I happened to be in organic chemistry at that time. And all that was just the most amazing experience that I had up to that point. And Mike Hiskey became a lifelong mentor to me. He was just probably the most critical person in my STEM career to really helping me to understand and to focus on being passionate about about the science that I wanted to pursue, and also getting into this area of energetic materials, because prior to that, I really knew nothing about explosives or fireworks or anything. I wasn't the typical kid who, took fireworks apart or, tried to make things with black powder or whatever. Whereas the majority of the people here, like, they kind of have that sort of background. They were interested in, as kids, in that. It wasn't until I met Mike Hiskey that I found that his passion was just so contagious. It was just, it was just an amazing experience.
That's awesome. And you with what you're talking about, with him and your mother and others, it really highlights the fact that it's never just one person. Right. It's always multiple people that help form us and help get us on that path that we eventually go down. And that, hearing that enthusiasm, and that's really, what, and oftentimes what helps us to realize what we want to get into, what we're passionate about, is that enthusiasm that others show or what we show. And on top of that, I think, it's just all those factors that play a role. So I think that's amazing.
So I didn't really explain the pre-med thing. And so I stayed pre-med up until I graduated from my undergraduate school. And my mentor there at Caltech, he wanted me to go into chemistry, and he wasn't too enthusiastic about me applying to only one medical school. So I only applied to the University of New Mexico, and I got in. So I knew I was going to be in the entering class of 1997, but I didn't know if I wanted to do that. And I didn't really have a lot of experience, like volunteering in a hospital or working in a hospital environment. I took a EMT class, so I became certified as an EMT as a part of a way to figure out, learning about some of these things that I had no real experience with. And so, I had all of these extremely fun and learning experiences here at the laboratory with Mike Hiskey. And I knew nothing about medical school really. And I thought, I should take a year off to really think about this. So I took the year off between graduating and going to med school. And I worked in the lab, every day for an entire year. And what happened in that process was everything that I learned in the classes, like, just solidified when I was doing hands-on work, and when I was doing that every single day. And it all made sense and everything clicked. And I was able to actually make progress on projects that were my own projects. So much so that I couldn't wait to get back to the lab. When the day was over, I didn't want to leave. And I couldn't wait to get back because it was just so exciting doing the work I was doing and working with Mike. But I didn't want to give up on medical school without, like, actually giving it a try. So I went to med school for about a semester and a half. And luckily they had us interact with patients right away, and we started, doing lots of things where you did people interactions. And so I had these two experiences, and I felt most, I guess, grateful, and also most like I was able to make a contribution in a lab setting. And I didn't think that I could make as much of a contribution in, like, the medical field, because I didn't feel my heart was as much into it. And so that was really the point where I made that decision. But it was an extremely difficult decision because, my parents, they know what a medical doctor is, right? But they didn't necessarily know what a Ph.D. chemist was. And I felt like I was going to really disappoint them if I didn't if I didn't see medical school through. But if I stayed in medical school, I wasn't going to be true to myself, and I wasn't going to have the opportunity to maybe be in a career where I could be more satisfied. so I just told my parents, I'm gonna try to go to grad school. I don't really like med school, and in fact, at the point where I decided to stop, it was already past the time for applying to grad school. So again, going back to networks, the professor that was my mentor at Caltech, I called him and I said, "Hey, this is my situation. Is there anything you can do to help me?" So he called probably 10 different chemistry departments and asked them if they would accept a late application from me. And maybe like half of them or 60% of them did. And, I just applied late, and that's how I ended up getting into grad school, was through, a completely different pathway. I didn't even take the GREs because I took the MCAT, and they just waived my, they just said, well, just take your MCAT scores. So it was quite an interesting journey, and a non-traditional way that I got there. But I eventually got there, and that's how I navigated pre-med and actually going to med school for a little while, and then eventually making it back into the laboratory.
It's never quite how you imagine it, is it? It's always
Right.
You go into you eventually get there, but you have to go through a lot of a little twist and turns to actually get to that point. And you brought up networking multiple times in that, and that's one thing we always encourage a lot of our volunteers and our interns here at the museum, is because I know it served me as well, and knowing what exactly I wanted to get into, and just having the making those connections while you're here or at school, it oftentimes is what gets you where you need to be. For me personally, I never really planned on getting into the education side of museum field. I always anticipated being a curator, or that's what I knew, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned before, that's what I was familiar with. I hadn't even thought about the fact that, people can get into the education side and put together events and work with kids and adults and help kind of educate on that side. And so through my networking, that's how I ended up here. And it's without that, I don't think I would have been as fulfilled as I am where I am now and in the role that I have. And so it's funny that you mentioned, because it's what we encourage all of our volunteers and interns, especially if they're going into school or are currently in school at the time. Just don't put yourself out there, make
Right.
friends, make connections, because oftentimes it's what gets you where you need to be. There's a lot of people who have those degrees, but it's those connections that really, set you up for success. So that's amazing, and
Right.
it's really cool to hear that. So that's a great lesson again. Really, really good to hear that. Now, shifting to the work in the department, now, how does it compare with what you envisioned? Because obviously you thought, okay, I want to be in the lab. This is what I want to do. Um, how did it compare with that vision that you had once you got to Los Alamos as a full-time employee?
So I had the prior experience working here in this group. I knew what the chemistry was like, and at the foundational kind of perspective, it's pretty much the same. So the organic chemistry knowledge, skills, the toolbox that I built, I'm using the same skills. It's just that I'm making different materials. So the kind of work that I do here is I'm working on a program that is funded by the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy jointly, and we're interested in making new energetic materials of a wide range of applications. And it changes from sort of year to year of what the focus might be, but in general, they're going to be explosives, propellants, or pyrotechnic type of ingredients. And so I use my organic chemistry that I learned in college as an undergrad, and also as a graduate student for my Ph.D. work. And those same set of skills are applied, here in my daily work. And now that I'm a deputy group leader, so it's a half-time position. So for half the time, I'm doing sort of science management. I'm managing people and their projects, and just the personnel aspects of managing people. And the other half of the time, I continue to do the same work that I've been doing since my postdoc. So making materials, applying them, testing them, seeing what kind of properties they have, characterizing them, those types of things. So in general, I already knew what the work was going to be like. And I just, in going to grad school, I was able to build a broader skill set to be able to apply to the challenging problems that we see here at work that we look at every day.
That's great. That's great. And now, talking more about your work, as we mentioned in the introduction to this interview, you're known for your many innovations in the area of energetic materials, and you actually hold 12 patents. Now, are you able to share some details about these advances with us? Because that's pretty cool. So I wanted to make sure we dug into that a little bit.
Yeah. So in one area, we developed some materials that were of high interest to the Disney Corporation for their firework displays. So at Disneyland, or Disney World, they can have firework displays like almost every night. And so if you live in the vicinity of these fireworks displays, sometimes the smoke that's generated can, flow into these different communities, and, people smell it, and maybe after, a while it gets pretty annoying and it can be a nuisance. But you also have all of the materials that don't completely get consumed in a firework, and they can fall back down onto the property of the Disney parks. And if you're doing these things every day, year after year after year, some of these chemicals can build up in the soils. And so there was a need to reduce the amount of smoke and also reduce the amount of these fallout chemicals that come back to the earth, which some of which can over time be not the best for the environment. So one of our patents was the invention of making a material that they're called high nitrogen materials. They have a lot of nitrogen atoms in them, and because of that, when they are burned in a combustion, they produce a lot of nitrogen gas, and they don't produce a lot of soot or carbon dioxide, things like that. And we got two really positive effects out of these things. We got less smoke, or even sometimes almost no smoke. And the other thing was, because there was no smoke, there was less of this like obscurant that was clouding the colors that were made by the fireworks. And so without these obscuring like smoke and fog and stuff, you could actually see the colors like much more brightly. And because of that, we could reduce the amount of the ingredients that make the colors by up to an order of magnitude, like by 10 times in some cases. And then those two effects essentially met the needs for what Disney was looking for. And so my colleague Mike Hiskey and another colleague Darren No and I, we basically spun off a company to make Pyrotechnics in northern New Mexico, and I was in grad school at the time, so they ended up doing like all the heavy lifting, and the patents that they generated from this spin-off company were then licensed by larger companies. And so when you see big events like the Olympics or World Cup soccer, Super Bowl, even indoor things like Disney on Ice concerts, things like that, it's pretty much guaranteed that you're seeing the technology that was originally developed by us here at the laboratory in those displays. And the devices themselves are based off of technologies that were licensed from the two of my colleagues. So that's one of the patents. Some of the other patents.
That's a pretty cool one. That's pretty amazing to, like, every time you see the Olympics or go to Disney World, Disneyland, to know that you had a hand in it. That has to be a pretty cool. You probably have to pinch yourself sometimes to realize that was something you worked on. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting perspective to go out and see, like, the technology isn't necessarily used right now in like the 4th of July displays and things like that, but they are ubiquitous in these entertainment venues. So yeah, it's definitely a kind of a shining, proud moment sort of a thing, looking back
Yeah.
on it.
Everybody wants to see their work, but you actually get to see it in in the sky. Like, that's amazing. So sorry, that just tickled me. So, but yeah, go ahead. Please go ahead with the other patents as well.
So a couple of other ones, just sort of quickly to highlight. One of them is this high nitrogen material that has just a huge amount of nitrogen in it, but it's also not an explosive, and so we can use it as a gas generator. So it has applications maybe in automobile airbags, but the one place where the technology was licensed was in the area of safety devices for like on airplanes. So the vests that you would put on if you were to make a water landing. So those vests are filled with carbon dioxide from a little carbon dioxide cartridge that's associated with the vest. And the same thing with the life rafts that are in a plane. So the application for the material we developed was that instead of having these pressurized gas cylinders of carbon dioxide, you could just have this solid, like in a container or something, and then you ignite it, whatever way, and then that gas generant would fill up the vest or the life raft. And the big savings here is that all of those little metal cylinders weigh quite a bit, whereas the solid itself in a cardboard container or whatever it is would weigh much, much less. And so you could have way less weight on the plane, which would allow you to carry a lot more like cargo. Mm-hmm. And so instead of putting that weight on a safety device, you could put that weight on making money by shipping things around. And so there was a big economic driver for trying to remove those devices, cartridge devices. And so that was one technology that was licensed, and I think it's still being looked at and investigated and developed. And then the other ones are more like Department of Defense materials, where they'll see a nice effect, like a faster burning rate for a propellant or a cooler burning rate, so that it doesn't fatigue the metals in the gun barrels or things like that. So those are just a couple of examples of the patent technologies that we developed while I was here.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I think that the thing that sticks out to me is just the broad range of advances, in the different areas, right? You have fireworks, and you have devices for aircraft, to protect passengers, flotation devices. So that's pretty amazing. Right. And it's just really interesting. So now, one thing that I want to get into is, in addition to your position as the deputy group leader, you also serve on the board of trustees for Caltech's NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory Oversight Committee, Student Experience Committee, the Technology Transfer Committee, and you're even on the ad hoc committee on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's a lot of stuff that you do. And so what is your role on the committees, and how did your experience at Los Alamos get you ready for that?
So my role on the different committees is essentially, as a committee member, we look at the different topics that are being explored in each of these different committees. And then we provide input or feedback on the initiatives that are being explored. For example, on the Student Experience Committee at Caltech, they had built a new house, an undergraduate dormitory. And at Caltech, they have this housing system where people come onto campus as freshmen, and then they choose which one of these houses they want to live in, and they sort of become part of that house in terms of like a school culture. And so I was part of Page House. That's the house that I chose to live in. And so I was always associated with that house, throughout my career at Caltech. And it's just sort of a part of a tradition. So bringing in a new dormitory is essentially creating a whole new opportunity for a culture to be established. And so there were lots of questions about how do we do this, and how do we determine what freshmen get to go there, and what about the other students that are already here, like they already have a house associated with them, but we need upperclassmen to go into these houses. How do we navigate all of these sort of social challenges of bringing in a new house and the unintended consequences that could come up in those areas. In technology transfer, we're looking at a number of different patents that professors have and trying to create avenues and pathways for these patents to become licensed and for them to start spinning off companies, maybe even by the professors themselves or other people that want to come in and license the technology and things like that. So my experience at the laboratory is sort of a couple-fold. One of them is that, particularly with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, that is what is called an FFRDC, or a federally funded research and development corporation, just like Los Alamos National Laboratory is. So contractors tend to manage those operations, and so here Triad is the company that manages Los Alamos, and at JPL it's Caltech. They're the managing entity. And so I have that experience of working at an FFRDC and understanding the inner workings and how the relations between the company and the government work, or the company and the Department of Energy. And so I'm able to apply those experiences there on that committee. And also with respect to diversity, I bring a role that I can ask the questions about the demographics and, what are the trends looking like at JPL, and how can we make different efforts or changes to change up demographics if things are looking a little bit not as good on one side or on another side or whatever. So that's really where I've been able to use my knowledge at the lab to apply to my knowledge at the Board of Trustees. And it's also vice versa. So both entities, from my perspective, gain by my participation, because I learn things about the way Caltech approaches business, or I'll learn things about the way the management of JPL approaches problem solving that are nearly identical problems to what we face here at Los Alamos. And I can, sort of do this cross-cutting, taking the best parts of what each entity does and then applying them as appropriate where they need to be applied, or at least making suggestions as to what could be done to solve some of the challenges that are faced at either place.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have anticipated that, but yeah, so you're essentially, it's helping you be more well-rounded in both, because right, you're getting a lot of that, those other experiences and other interactions. So that's incredible. I love that.
One other quick thing, and going back to networking again, is that the board members for Caltech on the Board of Trustees are just some of the most amazing and accomplished people like in the world, and just being able to be in the same room as them and learn from them and see how they think and see how they approach problems, that is a huge growing opportunity for me. As one example, the chair of the subcommittee on the diversity, equity, and inclusion is the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. And because I have, I'm on the committee with him, and, you just start to get to know people, I've been able to call upon him to ask, questions about leadership and, get mentoring from him and things like that. And I, as a kid growing up in Taos, New Mexico, I didn't even know what a chairman of a Joint Chiefs of Staff was, and now right, I could never have imagined that I'd be able to have the opportunity to learn from somebody who had those types of experiences in their life. So extremely grateful for all the opportunities I've been able to get just by serving on the Caltech board.
Fantastic. And you bring up another point too, is that we were talking about networking earlier, but it never stops, does it? Right. There's a lot that we can still, the learning process continues, and the people that we meet can really help us continue to grow.
Right.
That's incredible. I love that. Now, what do you feel best prepared you for your career? Is there something you wish you would have known before entering the workforce? Because it sounds like, you have a little bit of experiences, but is there anything that you kind of felt like you had to play catch up on?
So one area where I really experienced that probably to a maximum extent was when I started my freshman year at Caltech. I was not prepared at all for the rigor of that school. But luckily I was pretty naive. I was naive enough to even apply to that school. But once I got there, I was used to being the top student in my high school, and I was at the bottom, and that wasn't anything that I had ever experienced before. And I went through this phase of, I don't have any confidence in myself. I'm not going to be able to handle this. There's no way I can compete with these other students. They're so far ahead of me. And just the adversity in dealing with that was very, very difficult and very challenging. So, I nearly quit. Before the semester even started, because I was in a bridge program, which was meant to help me bridge the gap between high school and Caltech. And, I called my dad and said, I can't handle it here. Can you see if any other schools will accept late application? And before I made the final decision to just quit, I talked to the director of this bridge program and I said, hey, I want to quit. And the one thing that stuck in my mind, which I think stayed with me for the rest of my life, was he said that, school hasn't even started yet and you want to quit, like at least give it a try. You can always quit after the fact, but you're never going to get this opportunity again if you quit now. And I remembered being very grateful for being selected to go to Caltech, given the fact that I didn't really have the resume that typical students do. So I really felt impelled or compelled to give it my best shot, because this group of people on this selection committee, they gave me an opportunity where they could have given it to somebody else. And if I quit now, that's just not honoring the faith that they had that I could do it. So I stuck with it and I went through the whole process. And thankfully, back then, the first year was pass fail. So, there were no grades, and that really helped the transition immensely. And so by the end of the third quarter, I had adjusted. But what prepared me, I guess if I look back and what do I wish I knew before I entered all of that, I wish I knew better how to develop and have been prepared with a support system. I figured it out, but it was a steep learning curve. And so, finding the people who are having the same experience as you are, problem solving together in terms of how do we manage not only just the education part, the problem sets and things, but how do you navigate just school in general, all of these things. And then I think what helped me out a lot too, that I think is maybe a theme in this podcast, is observing what other people do and not being afraid to ask questions. And so, I observe what other students do. I didn't even know you could do research in college. And so I saw a student, talk to him. He's like, oh, I'm doing research in so-and-so's lab. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even know you could do that. And so then I went and, I like what this professor does. I'm going to go ask him, can I work in your laboratory? And just, absorbing everything that I possibly could and taking the parts that helped me out the most and then applying it and just, moving forward and trying to not let, pitfalls or things that didn't go right, the first time or whatever, hold me back. Just, let that go and kind of keep moving forward.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you. And, you speaking about pitfalls and challenges or adversity. Do you have any other stories about overcoming challenges or adversity that you'd be willing to share with us? In
So
addition,
so when I went to grad school at Harvard, I joined a group. It was Professor Eric Jacobson's group, and everybody has to present at a group meeting at some point, during their first year. And I remember preparing for this at a library and just thinking to myself, I'm going to be presenting to a Harvard professor, and I'm going to be presenting to all these postdocs and grad students in the chemistry department of Harvard. Everybody's going to know that I'm a fraud. Like, they're going to see right through me. They're going to know that I don't know what I'm talking about. They're going to know that I don't know anything about this field. And I started getting overwhelmed, and this is pretty typical. It's the imposter syndrome, and I kind of felt that at Caltech at the beginning, and it was kind of strange because I made it through Caltech and I graduated with honor in chemistry, and yet I was still feeling the same thing, and it didn't really make a lot of sense to me. How could I have made it through Caltech and still be feeling these things? And so it was a moment of how do I start letting that go? When am I going to finally believe in myself? And so I think it was at that moment that I just made the decision. Look, you wouldn't be here if people weren't already believing in you, and so let's go with that mindset instead of the other mindset. And from that point forward, I didn't really have those doubts about how I was prepared or what I knew. And of course, I'm not going to know everything, but that's part of the process, and I need to use those opportunities to learn more. But everybody's in the same boat. I'm not the only one that was there to learn. And so that's one story that I think is important with respect to challenges and adversity, and how did I overcome it?
Absolutely. And sometimes it is as easy as just saying, I choose to look at it this way, or make a conscious effort to look at it, take the situation and say, this is how I'm going to view this, and I'm going to get through it, and make it a positive instead of a negative. So that's great to hear. Right. Now, as a person of color in a STEM related field, have you had any interesting or unexpected experiences that you'd like to share with us?
So it's quite an interesting question, actually. My parents had this debate when my brother and I were born about how to raise us with respect to the language we were going to speak at home. And my dad wanted us to have Spanish as the first language, and my mom didn't want us to have Spanish as the first language, because from her experience, she felt that what she observed was people who had an accent tended to be at a disadvantage with respect to progressing through their careers. And she didn't want us to have this disadvantage. And so my mom won. So we didn't learn Spanish at home, even though my parents would speak it to each other occasionally, and my dad would definitely speak Spanish nearly 100% of the time to his relatives. But he didn't require us to speak back to him. He would even talk to us in Spanish, but we wouldn't be required to speak back in the language. And that still is kind of something that I carry with me today. I much more easily understand the Spanish language audibly, but being able to converse back, it's much more difficult because I just didn't practice. I didn't have years and years and years of practicing, but I had years of practice hearing it and then taking what I heard and comprehending it and understanding it. So from that perspective, I think my mom probably saved me some challenges in going through the process. So I don't feel like I really experienced a ton of sort of negative interactions or negative experiences with language. But there's occasionally times where you encounter maybe you might be passed over for some other thing, but you're not entirely sure why. So there's sometimes that doubt, you don't really know, like, why was I passed over? And you don't really know for sure. Occasionally at Caltech, I did encounter, not through like professors or anything, but through like maybe like staff or something like that, some sort of, I guess I would call it like some level of like discrimination, like you're probably not one of the students or something. Mm-hmm. But not I would say that in my overall experience, it wasn't really like anything like hugely impactful to me, but I credit a ton of that to my mom for having the foresight to kind of think about how things could impact me if they did things a certain way in terms of raising us.
It sounded like your mom took a lot of that into consideration. It sounded like she always really wanted, to give you, you said brother, to give you and your brother a chance to have that success and to then provide a better life.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Fantastic. Now, for our last question, do you have any advice or words of wisdom for the students or their parents, guardians, and teachers who may be listening? And then also, given that you're on a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, are there any resources or organizations that you recommend that they check out?
So some of the things that I would say have been themes in this podcast already. Those are making those networks early and often, reaching out to people, putting yourself out there, asking questions. That's really critical. No matter what kind of question you have, it's better to ask it and get an answer. And if the person that you asked the question of responds in a way that wasn't as positive as you had hoped, then just ask the same question to another person until you get the response that you're looking for. With respect to parents, one of the things that is pretty critical, I think, as kids start thinking about college is how do we pay for this? And a lot of kids will not apply to colleges that they could probably get into because they, how do you pay for something like that? And it's really more of a mindset, because that's in terms of a culture. Some cultures will think, when I get a bill, I need to pay that bill in full. And so if I see this tuition bill, and if you look at what is tuition for college X, Y, or Z, and you see what it is, there's no way you're going to be able to pay that. You're not going to be able to write a check for that. But there's just a ton of resources available for students and parents, families that have kids that have the ability to go to school, and people always willing to help you navigate the system so that you're able to get the education that you want or deserve, and still be able to figure out how to pay for it. So not letting finances be a barrier, I think, is pretty critical. For teachers, one of the things that I find incredibly impactful with respect to encouraging students to go into the STEM related fields is early access to research. And so that really helped me, being in that Project Seed program, because it gave me an idea of what is this really like? And it helped me gain confidence. It helped me create a network. and that network helped me throughout, the rest of my life. So early access to hands-on science and STEM experiences, essentially. That's pretty critical. Today, I was actually reading an article that said that where there's the biggest gap with respect to minorities entering the STEM field is with Latinx or Hispanic populations. And so the data was that they make up 17% of the STEM workforce, 17% of the workforce, but only 8% of the STEM workforce. And so there's a big opportunity there. There's I think, I can't remember how many, I think it was like 4.3 million jobs that go unfilled in like technically related areas right now in the US. So there's all these jobs out there that are just waiting for people to enter them. And there's this population that if you got double the amount of people, just to get them to match the percentage they are in the workforce anyway, it's like a problem and a solution, both, kind of right there, hand in hand. But it's how do you make that happen? So there's some resources that are available. So like the Project Seed is one example that takes typically students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds and gives them the summer opportunity to work. And they don't have to work at a national laboratory. They could work at a number of different areas, whether it's in industry or at a local college with a professor, or just anywhere where there's STEM research going on is sort of a possibility. But there's lots of other programs as well. There's the American Physical Society that offers something similar, and there's a number of different areas that you can explore in that kind of venue. One of these organizations that kind of puts all of these things together is an organization called SACNAS, or the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. And high school students can't be members, but they can be members in college. But you can still like look at all the resources that they have available to them through them. And that's one area where you can see like lots of different scholarship opportunities. You can see research opportunities. Once you're in school, you can see job opportunities as well. You're starting to look for your next step in your career. There's lots of different job openings that they advertise. So it's a great resource for a number of different things that are really helpful for students. So that's sort of where I would end on that topic.
Well, that's wonderful advice, and thank you so much for sharing those resources. We really appreciate that, because I know a lot of parents and teachers out there, it's, what's the next step? I want to get my child into this, but where do I go? And so that makes a world of difference. So thank you so much, Dr. Chavez, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. And we appreciate everyone out there listening to this podcast. So thank you again, Dr. Chavez, for being our guest today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it and enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Now, if you would like to learn more about the National Atomic Testing Museum or Los Alamos National Laboratory, you can visit our websites at nationalatomictestingmuseum.org and lanl.gov. You can find the NATM on Facebook and Twitter by searching Atomic Museum.